The metallic clang of the food tray hitting polished concrete echoed through the mess hall at Camp Pendleton like a gunshot. Red sauce splattered across the white floor in patterns that resembled blood spatter, bits of chicken and vegetables scattering in every direction. The woman knelt immediately, her silver-streaked hair falling forward to hide her 58-year-old face, weathered hands trembling slightly as she began gathering the scattered food piece by piece. "Watch where you're going, old lady," Bradley Fletcher's voice carried across the dining area with deliberate volume. The 21-year-old Marine recruit stood 6'3", his linebacker build filling out his uniform with the kind of easy confidence that came from never being challenged. "Didn't they teach you basic coordination back in whatever century you learned to walk?" His three companions laughed on cue. Kelvin Anderson, 20 years old and rail thin, barely looked up from his tablet where he was reviewing tactical manuals, but his smirk was visible. Iris Candace, 22 and already carrying herself like she owned the base, examined her nails with studied disinterest. Dylan Ronan, the youngest at 19, deliberately kicked a spoon toward the kneeling woman, metal scraping against concrete. "I heard she tells stories about being some kind of warrior," Bradley continued, playing to his audience. "What do you think, guys? You think Grandma here fought dinosaurs? Maybe she was at the Battle of Waterloo?" No one noticed how Martha Sullivan folded the paper napkin she'd picked up. The creases formed a perfect triangle, edges aligned with military precision, the kind of habit drilled in by 28 years of service that no amount of retirement could erase. No one saw how she kept her weight centered, even while kneeling, ready to spring into action in a heartbeat. No one registered how her pale blue eyes had already cataloged 3 exit points, 47 people in the dining area, 2 senior officers at a corner table, and the security camera mounted at ceiling level that had a blind spot near the kitchen entrance. Lieutenant Blake Forrester, 35 years old and built like someone who spent more time behind desks than in combat zones, glanced over from his position near the coffee station. His pressed uniform showed not a single wrinkle, his shoes reflected the overhead lights, and his expression held the kind of condescending pity reserved for people he considered beneath notice. "Sullivan," he called out, not bothering to approach, "when you finish cleaning that up, the entire mess hall needs to be mopped before 1900 hours. And I want the grease traps scrubbed. We can't have civilian staff setting a poor example for our Marines." Martha stood slowly, her movements economical and controlled. She collected the tray without speaking, without meeting anyone's eyes, without showing the slightest reaction to the mockery or the additional work assignment. Her silence seemed to irritate Bradley more than any protest would have. "I'm talking to you, old woman." He stepped closer, invading her space with the casual arrogance of someone who had never faced real consequences. "The least you could do is apologize for wasting food. Do you know how many starving people there are in the world?" Still Martha said nothing. She simply carried the tray toward the kitchen, her gait steady despite what should have been the embarrassment of public humiliation. But there was something in that walk, something that 20-year-old Private First Class Lily Brooks noticed from her position 2 tables away. The older woman's stride was too measured, too purposeful, each step covering exactly the same distance as the last. It was the walk of someone who had spent years marching in formation, someone for whom efficiency of movement had become as natural as breathing. In the kitchen, Corporal Mason Connor looked up from the industrial dishwasher he'd been loading. At 20, he was one of the few people on base who treated Martha with consistent respect, though he couldn't articulate exactly why. Maybe it was the way she organized the supply closets with tactical efficiency, or how she always seemed to know when someone needed extra food after a hard training day, or the quiet competence that radiated from her despite her seemingly menial position. "Ma'am, are you okay?" he asked, watching her scrape the ruined food into the disposal. "I heard what Fletcher said out there. That was way out of line." Martha's hands never stopped moving, rinsing the tray with the same methodical precision she applied to everything. "People say things when they don't understand." Her voice was quiet, carrying a hint of an accent that might have been from somewhere in the Midwest. "It's not worth getting upset over." "But you shouldn't have to." 23 minutes until the next meal service," Martha interrupted gently. "We need to prep the serving line for lunch. Focus on what matters, Connor. The rest is just noise." In the dining area, Kelvin Anderson had returned his attention to his tablet, scrolling through weapon specifications with the intensity of someone trying to prove his intellectual superiority. "Did you see the new M249 SAW manual update?" he called to Bradley. increased sustained rate of fire to 85 rounds per minute, completely changes the tactical applications for suppressive fire. Like you'd know, Bradley grinned. When's the last time you actually fired one of those things? Reading about weapons doesn't make you a warrior, Tech. Kelvin's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Gunnery Sergeant Raymond Cassian walked past their table. At 52, Cassian had the bearing of someone who'd earned his rank through decades of actual service rather than just showing up. His weathered face carried scars that spoke of deployments to places where people shot back, and his eyes missed nothing. He'd noticed Martha Sullivan from the moment she'd started working at the mess hall 6 months earlier. There was something familiar about her posture, about the way she moved through space, about how her eyes were always tracking, always assessing, always aware. It nagged at him like a half-remembered song, but he couldn't quite place where he'd seen that particular combination of grace and readiness before. Before we continue with Martha's story, we want to know, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your city and country in the comments below. If you believe that true heroes don't need to advertise their strength, hit that like button right now. And if you want more stories about underestimated warriors who prove everyone wrong, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Now, back to what happened next at Camp Pendleton. The afternoon shift brought new challenges wrapped in familiar mockery. Iris Candace had gathered a small group of fellow recruits near the serving line, her voice pitched to carry just far enough to be overheard. "I swear she's watching us," Iris said, examining her reflection in her phone screen. "Every time I look up, she's staring out the windows like she's expecting an invasion or something. It's creepy. My grandmother does the same thing, but that's because she's got dementia." Her friend Willow Hazel giggled, 21 years old and eager to fit in with the more popular recruits. "Maybe she thinks the Taliban is going to attack the mess hall. Should we tell her the war ended years ago?" Martha continued wiping down tables, her movements creating a methodical pattern that anyone with tactical training would recognize as a security sweep. Northeast quadrant cleared, southeast next, always maintaining awareness of entry points and potential threat vectors. But to the young Marines watching, she was just an old woman randomly cleaning surfaces. Dylan Ronan had been planning his prank for 3 days, ever since he'd discovered that Martha arrived early every morning to prep the kitchen. He'd carefully replaced the salt in her personal seasoning bowl with sugar, then sat back to wait for the entertainment. But when Martha began her food prep at 0530 hours the next morning, she had paused for exactly 3 seconds after dipping her finger in the bowl, identified the substitution without comment, and simply switched containers. No reaction, no complaint, no confrontation. The lack of response infuriated Dylan more than anger would have. He'd wanted chaos, embarrassment, maybe even tears. Instead, he'd gotten the same quiet competence that seemed to define everything Martha Sullivan did. So he escalated, leaving a series of increasingly elaborate obstacles in her path. Equipment moved to inconvenient locations, supply orders mysteriously changed, cleaning schedules altered without notice. Martha absorbed each attack with the same unshakable calm, adapting to new circumstances without visible frustration. When her locker was moved to the furthest point from the kitchen, she simply adjusted her schedule to arrive 5 minutes earlier. When someone replaced her comfortable work shoes with a smaller size, she wore her backup pair without complaint. When Dylan finally went too far and loosened the lid on an industrial-sized container of flour, creating a white explosion that covered Martha from head to toe, she'd stood in the cloud of powder for 3 full seconds before methodically beginning cleanup. But Dylan hadn't noticed how Martha's hands had automatically moved to defensive positions during those 3 seconds, muscle memory overriding conscious thought. He hadn't seen how she'd identified his hiding spot through peripheral vision in under 2 seconds. He certainly hadn't recognized that her calm acceptance wasn't weakness, but rather the iron control of someone who'd faced actual life-or-death situations and knew the difference between real threats and childish pranks. Lieutenant Forrester found Martha in the storage area 2 hours later, still working on flour removal. "Sullivan," his tone managed to convey both boredom and disdain. "This is unacceptable. The mess hall needs to maintain health standards. I'm assigning you additional duties until you can demonstrate proper attention to workplace safety." "Yes, sir," Martha's response was automatic, neutral, completely devoid of the anger or frustration that Forrester clearly expected. "Don't you have anything else to say?" Forrester pressed, disappointed by her lack of reaction. "No excuses? No complaints about how hard you work or how unfairly you're being treated? Martha looked at him directly for the first time, and for just a moment, Forrester felt something shift in the air between them. Her pale blue eyes held depths he hadn't expected, experience and authority that seemed completely at odds with her position as kitchen staff. Then she blinked, and the moment passed so quickly he wondered if he'd imagined it. "No, sir. I'll complete the additional duties." As Forrester walked away, he tried to shake off an uncomfortable feeling that he'd just missed something important. Behind him, Martha returned to her work, but not before her hand unconsciously touched the inside of her left forearm, where an old burn scar lay hidden beneath her long sleeves. Thermite grenade, Fallujah, November 2004. The scar tissue still remembered, even if nobody else did. The base alarm system chose that moment to begin its monthly test. A piercing wail that sent most of the mess hall staff jumping in surprise. Martha's reaction was instantaneous and reflexive. She dropped into a combat crouch, weight perfectly balanced, eyes scanning for threats, hands reaching for weapons that weren't there. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds and was over almost before it began, but Sergeant Cassian, passing by the storage area entrance, caught the movement. He stopped dead, recognition finally clicking into place. That wasn't panic. That wasn't the startled flinch of a civilian. That was training, deep training, the kind that became instinctive after years of conditioning. His own hands had moved the same way during his first few years after retirement. Muscle memory overriding rational thought every time unexpected loud noises occurred. Bradley Fletcher, retrieving something from his nearby locker, had witnessed the same moment but interpreted it completely differently. "Holy cow," he laughed, pulling out his phone. "Did you guys see that? The old lady just freaked out over a test alarm. I got it on video. This is going to be hilarious." Within minutes, the video had circulated through the recruit network, accompanied by mocking commentary about crazy old Sullivan and her PTSD from the Vietnam War or whatever. The consensus among the young Marines was that Martha was unstable, possibly dangerous in her incompetence, definitely someone who should be retired to a nursing home rather than working at a military facility. But Cassian wasn't laughing. He returned to his office and pulled up the base personnel files, running a search on Martha Sullivan that should have shown him basic employment records. What he found instead made his blood run cold. Most of her file was redacted, whole sections blacked out with security classifications he didn't have clearance to access. The only clear information was her start date, her current position, and a single note buried in the authorization section. Clearance, contact HQMC for full records. Headquarters Marine Corps. That kind of classification didn't get attached to kitchen staff. Cassian stared at his screen for a long moment, then picked up his phone. Before he could dial, however, a priority message flashed across his computer. Alert condition, yellow. Potential hostile activity detected 15 miles northeast. All personnel stand by for further instructions. The message should have generated immediate, organized response. Instead, it created chaos. The young recruits, many of whom had never faced anything beyond training scenarios, began flooding the communications network with questions and requests for orders. Lieutenant Forrester's office became a bottleneck as he tried to process threat assessments he didn't fully understand, coordinating with senior officers who were scattered across the base attending various meetings. Martha Sullivan, standing in the mess hall kitchen with a mixing bowl in her hands, heard the alert and felt something shift inside her. The civilian mask she'd worn for 6 months suddenly felt too tight, too constraining, too fundamentally wrong when American lives might be at risk. She set down the bowl with careful precision, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked out of the kitchen without a word to anyone. Mason Connor, watching her leave, felt a strange sense of foreboding. "Ma'am, where are you going? The alert says everyone should stay in their duty stations." Martha didn't answer. She walked through the mess hall with that same measured stride, but something had changed in her bearing. Her shoulders were back, her head up, her eyes no longer downcast, but scanning with obvious tactical purpose. Several Marines moved instinctively out of her path without quite understanding why. Kelvin Anderson, still at his usual table with his tablet, looked up as Martha passed. "Hey, Sullivan! You deaf? There's an alert. You're supposed to stay put, not wander around like—" He stopped mid-sentence because Martha had turned to look at him, and the expression on her face was nothing like the passive acceptance she'd shown for months. "The alert says possible hostile activity at 15 miles. Her voice had changed too, crisp and authoritative. That gives us approximately 12 minutes if they're using standard infiltration vehicles, 8 minutes if they have got faster transport. Current wind is out of the northeast at 7 miles per hour, temperature 68 degrees, which means optimal conditions for approach under minimal noise signature. The table fell silent. That wasn't the voice of a kitchen worker. That was tactical analysis delivered with the confidence of someone who'd planned dozens of defensive operations. How do you... Kelvin started, but Martha was already moving again, headed toward the eastern doors that led to the training grounds. For veterans and active duty personnel dealing with joint pain from years of service, advanced orthopedic solutions have revolutionized recovery. Modern medical technology now offers non-invasive treatments for chronic pain, specialized physical therapy programs designed for military injuries, and comprehensive rehabilitation services. These medical advances help maintain mobility and quality of life long after service ends. Veterans deserve access to cutting-edge health care that understands the unique demands their bodies endured during service. Bradley Fletcher caught up to Martha in the corridor, his initial impulse to mock her warring with a growing sense that something was very wrong with this picture. "Where do you think you're going? You can't just leave your station during an alert. That's against..." "The perimeter fence has weak points at sections 7 and 11, Martha interrupted without breaking stride. "If I were planning an infiltration, I'd use the drainage culvert at section 9, because it provides cover from the guard towers and the motion sensors have a 3-second delay in that zone." "How could you possibly know?" "Because I walked every inch of this perimeter when I started working here. Standard reconnaissance. You should know your defensive positions before you need them." Bradley grabbed her shoulder, intending to physically stop her, maybe force her back to the kitchen where someone with authority could deal with her apparent mental breakdown. The moment his hand made contact, Martha moved. It wasn't the wild flailing of someone panicked or the clumsy shoving of someone desperate. It was a perfectly executed Krav Maga wrist release, followed by a control hold that left Bradley gasping, his arm twisted behind his back in a position that hurt just enough to be persuasive without causing injury. Martha held him there for exactly 2 seconds, then released him and continued walking. "Don't touch me during tactical situations," she said over her shoulder. "It's dangerous for both of us." Bradley stood frozen, his wrist throbbing, his mind trying to process what had just happened. That technique, that control, that absolute efficiency of movement, those weren't skills you picked up at a senior citizen self-defense class. Those were military close combat skills, the kind that took years to master and drill into reflexive response. By the time Bradley recovered enough to follow, Martha had reached the base armory. The young Marine on guard duty, a 19-year-old private named Daniel something, stepped forward with his hand on his sidearm. "Ma'am, this area is restricted during alerts. I need you to..." "Private, what's your defensive plan if hostiles breach the eastern perimeter?" The question, delivered with command authority, made Daniel automatically respond. We secure the armory and wait for orders from..." "Wrong. If they breach eastern, they'll hit here first because weapons are the priority target. You need to prepare for immediate defense, which means you need to open that armory right now and start distributing weapons to anyone with combat qualifications." "I can't do that without authorization from..." "Then get on your radio and get that authorization. We've got maybe 6 minutes before this goes from theoretical to real." Daniel hesitated, caught between protocol and the absolute certainty in Martha's voice. While he debated, Martha walked past him to the armory window and began visually cataloging available weapons, her mind automatically running through ammunition counts, optimal deployment configurations, and defensive position strategies. "M249 squad automatic weapons, 4 units available," she muttered, half to herself. "M4 carbines, standard loadout, approximately 30 rifles. M203 grenade launchers, 2 units, ammunition storage, standard combat load ×3 for extended engagement. No anti-vehicle weapons visible, which means they're in secondary storage." "How do you know our inventory?" Daniel demanded, finally drawing his sidearm, though he kept it pointed at the ground. "That information is classified." Martha turned to face him, and for the first time since starting work at Camp Pendleton, she let the mask drop completely. "Because I helped design this armory layout when it was built in 1997. Because I spent 28 years learning everything there is to know about defensive operations. And because in about 4 minutes, you're going to need someone who knows what the hell they're doing when the shooting starts." The gunfire erupted at exactly that moment, shattering the tension with the unmistakable crack of AK-47s and the heavier thump of RPG launchers. Daniel's face went white. The radio on his belt exploded with panicked voices. Multiple units reporting contact along the eastern perimeter. Approximately 40 hostiles confirmed. Breach in progress at Section 9. Request immediate backup. Shots fired, shots fired, shots fired. Martha didn't wait for authorization. She moved to the armory door with the certainty of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, her hand reaching for the emergency release that would override the electronic lock. But the system required a code, and she'd been gone from active duty for 12 years, and there was no way the codes hadn't changed multiple times since... The door clicked open. Daniel had entered the override code, his training finally overriding his confusion about who this woman really was. "I'm going to get in so much trouble for this," he whispered. "You're going to save lives," Martha corrected, already inside and moving toward the M249 squad automatic weapon rack. "Now, listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once." Her hands moved with practiced confidence, pulling the saw from its storage rack, checking the feed mechanism, verifying the sight alignment, performing a complete function check in 17 seconds flat. Every movement was muscle memory, the kind of intimate knowledge that came from thousands of hours of training and combat use. Kelvin Anderson, who had followed the commotion, stood in the doorway watching with his mouth open. He'd spent 3 months studying weapons manuals, memorizing specifications and tactical applications, writing detailed notes about sustained fire rates and optimal engagement distances. Watching Martha handle the M249, he realized with humbling clarity that he knew absolutely nothing. "That's not possible," he breathed. "That's a 17-step field verification protocol. It takes trained operators at least 30 seconds. You did it in 17 seconds, Martha confirmed, already moving to check the next weapon, which is 3 seconds slower than my record from 2008. Age slows you down, Anderson, but skill doesn't just disappear." The sound of gunfire was getting closer now, the distinctive rhythm of multiple weapons engaged in coordinated assault. Through the armory window, Marines could be seen running toward defensive positions. Some with weapons, many without, most looking confused about what they were supposed to be doing. Lieutenant Forrester's voice over the loudspeaker system was trying to give orders, but the commands were contradictory and growing increasingly panicked. Martha grabbed a tactical radio from the communications rack, punched in a frequency that Daniel's clearance shouldn't have known, and spoke with the absolute authority of someone who expected to be obeyed. "All available personnel with combat qualifications, this is Sullivan. I'm at the main armory distributing weapons. If you want to live through the next hour, get here now and follow my orders. We have approximately 80 personnel on base, 40+ confirmed hostiles, and maybe 3 minutes before they're inside the wire. Move now." Sergeant Cassian was the first to arrive, running despite his 52 years, his face set in grim determination. He took one look at Martha Sullivan efficiently arming Marines and coordinating defensive positions, saw the way she moved and spoke and commanded, and everything clicked into place. "Fallujah," he said, his voice tight with recognition and something approaching awe. "November 2004, Operation Phantom Fury. You're the sergeant major who held the northern defensive position for 6 hours while wounded. They said you saved an entire platoon." Martha's hands never stopped moving, but her eyes met Cassian's for just a moment. "That's classified, Gunny, and right now, we've got bigger problems than my service record. Ma'am, I need you to know, you need to take position 7 with a fire team and establish overwatch on the eastern approach. The hostiles are going to try to suppress our response from that direction, and I need experienced personnel containing them while I coordinate the overall defense. Can you do that?" Cassian snapped to attention with perfect precision, decades of training overriding his shock. "Yes, ma'am. Sergeant Major?" The title hung in the air like a bomb detonation. Every Marine within earshot froze. Sergeant Major, one of the highest enlisted ranks in the Corps, a position of authority and experience that commanded absolute respect. Not kitchen staff, not a civilian worker, not someone you mocked for entertainment. If you're getting chills watching Martha's skills emerge, wait until you see what happens next. Make sure you're subscribed because this story is about to escalate in ways you won't believe. Drop a comment telling us what military skills surprised you most so far. Now let's see how the recruits react. Bradley Fletcher felt his stomach drop as memory replayed every insult, every mocking comment, every casual dismissal he'd directed at Martha Sullivan over the past 6 months. Sergeant Major. He'd called a Sergeant Major grandma. He'd deliberately tripped her, laughed at her, suggested she belonged in a nursing home. The full weight of his actions hit him like incoming artillery, but there was no time for shame or apology, because the hostiles had breached the perimeter fence and were advancing with the kind of coordinated tactics that spoke of military training and careful planning. This wasn't random violence. This was a planned assault by people who knew what they were doing. Martha had moved outside the armory to an elevated position that provided clear sight lines to the eastern approach. The M249 SAW was mounted on a hastily assembled bipod, ammunition belt feeding smoothly, her eye behind the scope with the practiced ease of someone who'd made this weapon an extension of her body. Echo Team, suppress fire from North Ridge. Her voice over the tactical radio was steady, almost calm. Bravo Team, flank left through the supply depot. Charlie Team, I need you establishing overwatch on Building 7. Move now, people. Time is not our friend. The Marines moved automatically to obey, their training taking over despite the surreal situation of taking orders from someone they'd thought was just kitchen staff. Bradley found himself assigned to ammunition runner, carrying heavy boxes of belted rounds to defensive positions, his linebacker build finally useful for something beyond intimidation. Kelvin discovered that his technical knowledge was actually valuable when Martha directed him to use his tablet to access base security systems, jamming enemy communications and providing real-time intelligence on hostile movements. His hands shook as he worked, but his mind focused with laser precision on the immediate problem. Iris Candace and Willow Hazel found themselves sorting ammunition and preparing medical supplies, work that seemed mundane until the first wounded Marine was brought in with a shoulder wound, and suddenly the difference between being prepared and being useless became terrifyingly clear. Dylan Ronan, the prankster who had spent months trying to make Martha's life miserable, was assigned to coordinate defensive positions on the southern perimeter. When he hesitated, uncertain if he was capable of the responsibility, Martha's voice cut through his doubt. Ronan, you spent 3 months planning pranks that required detailed knowledge of schedules, movement patterns, and personnel locations. Apply those same analytical skills to predicting enemy approach vectors. You've got this. Now move. The unexpected confidence in her voice did something to Dylan's fear. If this legendary sergeant major believed he could do this, then maybe he could. He grabbed a radio and began coordinating teams with surprising effectiveness. His detailed knowledge of the base layout suddenly transformed from liability to asset. Lieutenant Forrester arrived at Martha's position, his face flushed with confusion and anger. Sullivan, what the hell is going on? You can't just take command of base defense. I'm the ranking officer, and I demand you— Sir, Martha's voice remained respectful but firm. With all due respect, you've never commanded personnel under fire. I've done it for 28 years. Right now, our job isn't about rank. It's about keeping these Marines alive. I need you on the radio coordinating with external support, getting us reinforcements and air cover. Can you do that? Forrester wanted to argue, wanted to assert his authority, wanted to put this woman back in her place as kitchen staff who'd somehow gone rogue. But he could see the defensive positions taking shape with professional efficiency, could hear the coordinated radio chatter replacing earlier panic, could feel the difference between chaotic response and organized defense. His pride warred with his duty, and for once in his career, duty won. I'll get us back up, he said finally, his voice quiet. But after this is over, there are going to be serious questions about chain of command, and after this is over, sir, we'll have time for whatever discussions you want. Right now, we've got incoming. The hostile assault intensified, as if in response to the improved Marine defenses. RPG rounds struck building walls, rifle fire poured in from multiple directions, and for several minutes the situation teetered on the edge of complete chaos. But Martha's positioning had been perfect, her understanding of defensive tactics creating interlocking fields of fire that forced the hostiles into predetermined kill zones. The M249 in her hands spoke with measured authority, 3-round bursts placed with surgical precision, each shot eliminating a specific threat rather than simply suppressing fire. Marines who had never seen combat before watched in awe as this 58-year-old woman demonstrated what real expertise looked like under pressure. Chief Warrant Officer Aaron Doc Jasper arrived 45 minutes into the firefight. leading a medical response team to treat casualties. He was halfway across the compound when he caught sight of Martha Sullivan behind the saw, her profile backlit by muzzle flash, her stance and bearing achingly familiar. He stopped so suddenly that the corpsman behind him nearly ran into his back. "That's not possible," Doc whispered, memories flooding back from a dusty street in Fallujah, November 2004, when the world had gone to hell and a sergeant major had appeared out of nowhere to pull his shattered unit back from annihilation. She'd been younger then, her hair dark instead of silver, but the way she moved, the absolute confidence under fire, the precise application of overwhelming violence in defense of her people, those hadn't changed at all. Doc had spent 12 years trying to find that sergeant major again, wanting to thank her for saving his life, but the official records had been redacted, her identity classified beyond his clearance level, and she'd been working in the kitchen at Camp Pendleton for 6 months, serving him breakfast, cleaning tables while he ate lunch, invisible in plain sight because nobody looked at support staff closely enough to recognize a legend. "Sullivan," Doc breathed the name like a prayer, then louder, pushing forward through the chaos. "Sergeant Major Sullivan, Sergeant Major!" Martha's head turned at the use of her rank and name together, her eyes finding Doc's face across 30 yards of combat zone. Recognition flickered, but she didn't pause in her fire discipline, didn't break her tactical rhythm, simply nodded once in acknowledgement before returning her focus to the battle. But that single nod confirmed everything. Doc's unit wasn't going crazy. The impossible was real. The legend was here, had been here all along, hiding in plain sight, while Marines who should have known better treated her like she was nothing. The firefight reached its crescendo and broke. The hostile forces, realizing they were facing more organized resistance than expected, more casualties than planned, began a fighting withdrawal. Martha coordinated pursuit teams to ensure the retreat was genuine, established security perimeter positions to prevent counterattack, and only then, 73 minutes after the first shot was fired, did she lower the M249 and allow herself to take a full breath. The compound was secured. 0 friendly fatalities, though 8 Marines would need medical treatment for wounds ranging from minor to serious. 40-plus hostile forces had been repelled by defenders who'd been unprepared, disorganized, and mostly inexperienced. It should have been a disaster. Instead, it was a textbook example of expert defensive operations. Martha stood slowly from her firing position, joints protesting the 73 minutes of sustained combat readiness. She was removing the ammunition belt from the saw when her shirt caught on the weapon's feed mechanism, the fabric tearing with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden relative quiet. The torn shirt pulled away from her right shoulder blade, exposing skin that told stories most people would never want to hear. The Force Reconnaissance emblem was inked there in faded but still clear detail, eagle, globe, and anchor, with parachute wings, marking her as belonging to one of the Marine Corps' most elite units. Below the emblem, dates, 1985 to 2013. 28 years of service rendered in permanent ink. But it was the scarring that made several nearby Marines actually gasp. Shrapnel wounds formed a constellation pattern across her back, the kind of damage that could only come from an IED blast at close range. Each scar was a story of pain survived, of missions completed despite injuries that would have ended lesser warriors. And on her left ribs, partially visible through the torn fabric, another tattoo, Fallujah 2004, with coordinates that any Marine who'd studied Operation Phantom Fury would recognize as the site of some of the most intense urban combat in modern military history. For 3 full seconds, absolute silence reigned. The sound of distant gunfire had faded. The frantic radio chatter had stopped. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Bradley Fletcher stood 10 feet away, his mouth open, his brain refusing to process what his eyes were showing him. That tattoo, those scars, that evidence of service and sacrifice, worn by the woman he'd called crazy, old, useless. Kelvin Anderson's tablet slipped from his hands, clattering on concrete, the sound breaking the spell. His voice came out as barely a whisper. "Force Recon. Those dates. She served for 28 years. That's impossible. She's a legend," Sergeant Cassian finished, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Sergeant Major Martha Sullivan, Operation Phantom Fury. She held a defensive position single-handedly for 6 hours while wounded, saved an entire platoon that was supposed to be wiped out. I read the classified after-action reports. They said she was the most decorated woman in Marine Corps history. 3 Bronze Stars, Silver Star for Valor, Purple Heart for those wounds we can all see now. Lily Brooks gasped, her hand going to her mouth. Oh my God. We made fun of her, all of us. We treated her like she was nothing, Iris Candace finished, tears starting to stream down her face. My grandfather was Force Recon. He died in Afghanistan when I was 15. He would be so ashamed of me right now. What we did to her. The sound of boots on concrete announced Doc Jasper's approach. He pushed through the gathering crowd, his medical kit forgotten, his weathered face transformed by recognition and something approaching religious awe. When he reached Martha, he didn't speak immediately. He simply stared at her face, her tattoos, her scars, confirming what his heart had already known. Sergeant Major Sullivan, his voice cracked with emotion. Fallujah, November 2004. 3rd Platoon, Alpha Company. You saved us. You pulled 6 of us out of a kill zone under sustained enemy fire. I was one of them. These scars on my arm, he rolled up his sleeve, showing old injury marks, came from the same IED that hit you. You were carrying me when it detonated. You should have died. We all should have died, but you got us out anyway. Martha's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes softened slightly. Doc Jasper, I remember. You kept trying to apologize for being heavy while I was carrying you. I told you to shut up and save your breath. You saved my life, Doc said simply, and I've spent 12 years trying to find you to say thank you. They told me your identity was classified, that you disappeared into some secret program. I never thought. He gestured around the mess hall, the kitchen, the compound. Why here? Why like this? Martha's hands moved automatically, field stripping the M249 for cleaning despite the emotional weight of the conversation. My son was Captain Seth Sullivan, Marine Corps officer, KIA Afghanistan, April 2015. After I buried him, I realized I didn't want to be in command anymore, didn't want to make decisions that might cost other mothers their children, but I couldn't leave completely, couldn't stop serving. So I found this position, kitchen staff on a training base, close to young Marines, close to people like him, close to the Corps without being responsible for sending anyone into danger. The revelation hit the assembled Marines like a physical force. She'd lost a son, lost him to the same service she'd given 28 years of her life to, and instead of becoming bitter, instead of walking away, she'd chosen to stay close to the next generation of warriors, even if it meant accepting mockery and disrespect from people too young and too ignorant to recognize what she'd sacrificed. Military families face unique financial challenges that require specialized planning. Veterans Financial Services now offer tailored investment portfolios, retirement planning that maximizes military benefits, and insurance coverage designed for service members' specific needs. Professional financial advisors who understand VA benefits, military pensions, and transition challenges can help secure long-term financial stability. Proper financial planning ensures that years of service translate into lasting security for veterans and their families after retirement. Bradley Fletcher's legs gave out. He actually fell to his knees, his linebacker frame suddenly small and broken by the weight of understanding what he had done. Sergeant Major, Words failed him. How did you apologize for months of cruelty directed at someone who'd given everything for country and Corps? How did you explain mockery aimed at a mother who'd buried her only child? I have no excuse. There's nothing I can say that would make this right. I disrespected everything you represent, everything you sacrificed, everything you lost. I'm sorry. I know that's not enough, but I'm so sorry. Martha finally looked at him directly, and Bradley flinched from the weight of those pale blue eyes that had seen combat and death and sacrifice beyond his imagination. But there was no hatred in her gaze, no desire for revenge, just tired acceptance of human nature and its capacity for casual cruelty. You fought well today, she said quietly. When the shooting started, you followed orders, carried ammunition under fire, helped defend your brothers and sisters in arms. That's what matters now. You learned something today, Fletcher. The question is whether you'll remember it tomorrow and the day after and every day for the rest of your career. Yes, ma'am, Bradley's voice shook. I swear to you, I'll never forget this. I'll never make this mistake again. Kelvin Anderson approached more slowly, his tablet clutched against his chest like a shield. "Sergeant Major, I questioned your knowledge. I thought I was smart because I'd read manuals and memorized specifications. I didn't understand that reading about war isn't the same as surviving it. Could you teach me? Real tactics, not just theory?" "Anderson, you used your technical skills exactly right during the defense. You jammed enemy communications, provided real-time intelligence, adapted your knowledge to immediate problems. You did good work. But yes, if you want to learn more, I'll teach you. 0500 hours, 3 times a week. Bring coffee. We'll start with the basics." Iris Candace's tears had progressed from silent crying to genuine sobs. Willow Hazel stood beside her, looking equally devastated. "My grandfather," Iris managed between gasps, "was Force Recon. He died in Helmand Province when I was 18. I worshipped him. I joined the Marines because of him. And I treated you—" She couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't articulate the depth of her betrayal of everything her grandfather had represented. Martha's expression softened, in a way the other Marines hadn't seen before. She walked to Iris, her stride still carrying military precision, despite the emotional weight of the moment. What was his name? Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Candace. He served from 1982 to 2012. "I knew him," Martha said simply. "We served together in Desert Storm. Good man, great Marine. He would have wanted you to learn from this, not be destroyed by it. Honor his memory by becoming the kind of Marine he would be proud of." Dylan Ronan had been hanging back, unable to face Martha directly, but her words to Iris gave him courage he didn't know he possessed. "Sergeant Major, I pranked you. For months. I thought it was funny. I thought making your job harder was entertainment. I put sugar in your seasoning, moved your equipment, caused you extra work. There's nothing I can say except that I was wrong, and I'm sorry, and I'll spend however long it takes making this right." Martha considered him for a long moment. "You coordinated the southern defensive positions well today, Ronan. Used your knowledge of base layout to predict enemy approach vectors. You've got tactical instincts. The question is whether you'll use them for good or for pranks. What's it going to be?" "Good, ma'am. Always good from now on. This is the moment everything changes. If you've been holding your breath, you're not alone. Hit that like button if you can't wait to see the full reveal. Share this video with anyone who needs to see why you should never judge someone by their appearance. Now, watch what happens." The sound of approaching helicopters announced the arrival of reinforcements and senior leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Forrester had finally gotten through to base command, and the response was immediate. Multiple aircraft appeared on the horizon, carrying quick reaction forces, medical support, and investigators who would spend weeks trying to understand how a middle-aged kitchen worker had single-handedly organized a successful defense against 40-plus trained hostiles. But before they landed, one more person needed to arrive at Martha's position. Captain Fiona Carter had been in the base intelligence center when the attack began, and she'd spent the entire firefight pulling Martha Sullivan's classified service record, piece by piece, clearance level by clearance level, until the full scope of what she was seeing finally emerged from the redactions. She ran across the compound now, a thick folder clutched in her hands, her normally composed intelligence officer expression shattered by shock and something approaching awe. "Sergeant Major," she was breathing hard from the run, "I need you to know I've seen your full record, all of it. Everything that was classified." Martha's hands paused in their weapons maintenance. "Captain, that information is restricted for good reason. I know, ma'am, but these people—" Fiona gestured to the gathered Marines, the young recruits whose world had just been turned inside out. "They deserve to know who you really are, what you really did." Before Martha could respond, Fiona began reading from the folder with the formal precision of an official briefing. "Sergeant Major Martha Elizabeth Sullivan. Service dates June 1st, 1985 to December the 31st, 2013. Total service 28 years, 7 months. Units served: 1st Force Reconnaissance Company, 2nd Force Reconnaissance Company, Marine Special Operations Command. Deployments: Operation Desert Storm, Operation Iraqi Freedom, Operation Enduring Freedom, 15 separate classified operations." She paused, taking a breath, then continued with the decorations list that made several Marines actually step backward in disbelief. Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry in combat operations, Fallujah, November 2004. 3 Bronze Stars with Valor Device for heroic action under fire. Purple Heart for wounds received in combat. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal with Combat Distinguishing Device. 4 separate unit citations for extraordinary heroism. The list went on for 2 full minutes, each medal and commendation representing missions that had pushed human endurance and courage beyond normal limits. By the time Fiona finished, several young Marines were openly crying, confronting the reality that they'd treated a genuine American hero as if she were less than nothing. Fiona pulled out a photograph from the folder, holding it up for everyone to see. The image showed a younger Martha, maybe 35 years old, in full combat gear and covered in dust and blood. She was standing with 6 other Marines, all of whom looked like they'd been through hell. At the bottom of the photo, a caption read, 3rd Platoon, Alpha Company, Fallujah, November 12, 2004. SGM Sullivan and rescued personnel. Doc Jasper pointed to the photograph with a shaking hand. That's me, second from the left. Look how young I was. 23 years old and scared out of my mind. She carried me 400 meters under sustained enemy fire, with shrapnel in her back from the same IED that wounded me. She shouldn't have been able to walk, let alone carry a fully grown man in combat gear. But she did. She got all 6 of us out when we should have died. Fiona produced more photographs, more documentation, building a picture of service and sacrifice that felt almost impossible to believe. Martha in Desert Storm, directing defensive operations during the ground campaign. Martha in Afghanistan, coordinating special operations missions in mountain terrain. Martha receiving the Silver Star from a 3-star general who was quoted in the accompanying article as saying she was the finest combat leader I've ever had the privilege of moving alongside. And then Fiona pulled out the final document, the one that explained everything about Martha's current position and her choice to work in the kitchen at Camp Pendleton. Official Marine Corps casualty notification. Fiona's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Captain Seth James Sullivan, Marine Corps officer, killed in action, Helmand Province, Afghanistan, April 17, 2015, age 27, survived by mother, Sergeant Major Martha Elizabeth Sullivan, USMC, retired. The grief in the compound was palpable. Martha's son hadn't just been a Marine. He'd been a captain, a leader, someone who had followed his mother into service and paid the ultimate price. And instead of becoming bitter, instead of hating the Corps that had taken her only child, Martha had chosen to stay close, to serve in whatever capacity allowed her to be near the next generation of warriors. Master Sergeant Audrey Ghost Erica had arrived during Fiona's briefing, and she pushed through the crowd now with the authority of someone who knew exactly who Martha Sullivan was and what she represented. At 42, Audrey was one of the Marine Corps' top sniper instructors, and her face showed both respect and guilt as she addressed her former teacher. Sergeant Major Sullivan, Audrey's voice carried military formality. For those who don't know, this woman trained me in 2008. She's forgotten more about combat tactics than most of us will ever learn. I would not be alive today without the skills she taught me, and we've been treating her like... Words failed even the normally articulate sniper instructor. Martha finally set down the weapon she'd been cleaning, standing to face the assembled Marines with that same quiet dignity that had defined her interactions for the past 6 months. Everyone makes assumptions. You saw an old woman working in a kitchen, and you assumed that meant she was weak, unskilled, unimportant. You weren't wrong to judge based on visible evidence. You were wrong to stop looking deeper. But we should have known, Bradley protested. We should have seen what? A tattoo hidden under long sleeves? Scars covered by kitchen uniforms? Combat skills I deliberately didn't demonstrate? I chose invisibility, Fletcher. That's on me, not on you, though your behavior would have been inappropriate regardless of my background. Lieutenant Forrester finally approached, his earlier bureaucratic arrogance completely shattered. Sergeant Major, I owe you an apology that I don't even know how to begin. I treated you as if you were subordinate, as if you were someone who didn't matter, as if years of service and sacrifice meant nothing. I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. Martha studied him with those pale blue eyes that had evaluated hundreds of Marines over 28 years of service. Lieutenant, you made a common mistake. You equated position with worth. You thought because I was working in the kitchen that I must be less capable, less experienced, less valuable than people in combat roles. But logistics, support, maintenance, All the jobs that keep a base running, those are done by people with stories you'll never know unless you take time to ask. Learn that lesson. Apply it to everyone you command. The arrival of Lieutenant General Alexander Hector, 3 hours after the firefight ended, brought with it the full weight of Marine Corps authority and the promise of answers that half the base was desperate to hear. His helicopter touched down with military precision, and the moment his boots hit concrete, every Marine within sight snapped to attention with reflexes honed by years of training. Hector was 56 years old, silver-haired, and carried himself with the kind of natural command presence that made junior officers nervous and senior enlisted personnel respectful. He'd earned his stars through 3 decades of combat leadership, and his reputation for no-nonsense assessment of tactical situations preceded him by about a mile. He strode directly toward Martha Sullivan's position, his aide struggling to keep up with his purposeful pace. The crowd of Marines parted automatically, creating a pathway that led straight to where Martha stood, beside the disassembled M249, her hands still performing the methodical cleaning that muscle memory demanded even during emotional chaos. Martha saw him coming and straightened instinctively, her civilian clothing suddenly feeling inappropriate for the moment. But before she could decide whether protocol demanded she stand at attention despite being retired, Hector did something that made every witness freeze in absolute shock. He came to a complete stop 3 feet in front of Martha Sullivan, brought his heels together with a sharp click, and rendered a salute so crisp and formal that it could have been used in a recruiting commercial. His voice when he spoke carried across the compound with perfect clarity. Sergeant Major Martha Elizabeth Sullivan, on behalf of the United States Marine Corps and a grateful nation, welcome back to the fight. The salute hung in the air for 3 full seconds before Martha, operating on 28 years of ingrained response, returned it with equal precision. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. A lieutenant general, one of the highest-ranking officers in the Marine Corps, had just publicly acknowledged and honored a retired enlisted service member. It was a gesture that spoke volumes about Martha's reputation and the respect she commanded among those who actually knew her story. When Hector finally dropped his salute, his stern expression softened into something approaching a smile. "I've been reading after-action reports about you for 20 years, Sergeant Major. It's an honor to finally meet you in person. Though I have to say, when I got the call that you'd organized the defense of Camp Pendleton from a kitchen position, I thought someone was playing a very elaborate prank. Sir, I was available and qualified. The situation required immediate response. The situation required a tactical genius with 28 years of combat experience, which is exactly what it got. 0 friendly fatalities against 40-plus trained hostiles. That's not luck, Sergeant Major. That's expertise." Hector's gaze swept across the assembled Marines, lingering on Bradley, Kelvin, Iris, and Dylan with the kind of penetrating attention that made them all want to dig holes and hide. Though I understand there were some personnel issues prior to today's events, the 4 recruits looked like they wanted the earth to swallow them whole. Colonel Samuel Archer, who'd arrived with Hector's command group, stepped forward with a folder of his own. "Sir, I've compiled preliminary reports on the base climate and interactions with Sergeant Major Sullivan prior to the attack. It appears there was a pattern of disrespectful behavior from multiple personnel who were unaware of her background and service record." "Unaware," Hector repeated the word like he was tasting something unpleasant. "That's an interesting way of saying they judge someone by appearance rather than taking time to understand who she actually was." He turned his attention to Bradley Fletcher specifically. "Marine, you're listed in these reports as a primary instigator of harassment. What do you have to say for yourself?" Bradley stood at rigid attention, his face pale, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, I have no excuse. I treated Sergeant Major Sullivan with disrespect and cruelty. I mocked her service, her experience, and her presence on this base. I was wrong, and I'm prepared to accept whatever punishment you deem appropriate." "Punishment," Hector considered the word. "What punishment do you think would be appropriate for mocking a Silver Star recipient? For harassing a combat veteran who's sacrificed more for this country than you can possibly imagine?" "Sir, because I'll tell you what I think the appropriate response is, Marine. I think you should spend the next year learning everything Sergeant Major Sullivan is willing to teach you. I think you should take that linebacker build and that aggressive energy and channel it into becoming the kind of Marine who would make her proud. I think you should remember this moment every single day for the rest of your career and let it shape how you treat every person you encounter, regardless of their position or appearance. Bradley blinked, confused. Sir, you're not going to discipline me? Oh, I am disciplining you, Fletcher. I'm disciplining you by making you live with the knowledge of what you did and who you did it to. I'm disciplining you by giving you the opportunity to become better rather than just punishing you for being ignorant. But make no mistake, if I hear you've wasted this opportunity, if I get even one report that you've failed to learn this lesson, I will personally ensure that your Marine Corps career is the shortest and most miserable in the history of this organization. Do I make myself clear? Yes, sir. Crystal clear, sir. Hector turned his attention to the other 3 recruits, delivering similar messages calibrated to their specific failings. Kelvin would be required to spend time learning that technical knowledge without tactical experience was just theory. Iris would be mentored on respecting all service members regardless of age or position. Dylan would be directed toward positive applications of his planning skills. But then Hector addressed Lieutenant Blake Forrester, and the temperature in the compound seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lieutenant, you're the ranking officer in this section. You had authority over base operations and personnel management. How did you allow a Silver Star recipient to be harassed for 6 months? Forrester's mouth opened and closed several times before words emerged. Sir, I didn't know her background. Her file was classified, and you assumed that someone working in the kitchen must be unimportant. You assumed that service record didn't matter if someone was in a support position. You assumed that your rank made you superior to someone with 30 years more experience than you have. Hector's voice could have etched glass. Those assumptions nearly cost us this base, Lieutenant. If Sergeant Major Sullivan hadn't been here, if she hadn't taken initiative despite having no official authority, we'd be counting casualties instead of celebrating a defensive success. Yes, sir. I understand, sir. I'm removing you from your current position, effective immediately. You'll be assigned to logistics operations under the direct supervision of Sergeant Major Sullivan, assuming she's willing to accept that responsibility. You'll learn what it means to serve in support roles, to value every position that contributes to mission success, and to never, ever judge someone's worth by their job title. Is that understood? Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Martha had remained silent during these exchanges, but now she cleared her throat gently. General Hector, with respect, I'm retired. I'm not sure I'm the appropriate person to be supervising active duty officers. Hector smiled, and there was something in that expression that suggested he'd been waiting for exactly this objection. About that, Sergeant Major, I have a proposal I'd like to discuss with you privately, if you're amenable. They withdrew to Colonel Archer's office, leaving the compound buzzing with speculation about what kind of proposal a lieutenant general would make to a retired combat veteran who'd been working in the kitchen. The conversation lasted 45 minutes, and when they emerged, Martha's expression was unreadable, but Hector looked satisfied. Sergeant Major Sullivan has agreed to accept a position as Combat Tactics Advisor, civilian status, with full access to base resources and authority to implement training programs as she sees fit. She'll continue her kitchen work if she chooses, but her primary responsibility will be mentoring the next generation of Marines in defensive operations, tactical decision-making, and the kind of combat leadership that can't be taught from manuals. The announcement sent ripples through the assembled personnel. Martha would be staying, but in a role that finally acknowledged her capabilities and experience. It was a compromise that allowed her to remain close to the young Marines she'd come to care about, while also contributing her expertise to their development. But the revelations weren't finished. Master Sergeant Audrey Erica approached Martha with a request that would reshape base training protocols for years to come. Sergeant Major, I'd like permission to incorporate your defensive tactics from today into the sniper school curriculum. The way you coordinated fields of fire, established kill zones, and maintained situational awareness while personally engaged in combat, that's the kind of multitasking that our advanced students need to learn. Would you be willing to work with me on developing that training module? Martha considered the request, her mind already running through pedagogical structures and training progressions. The tactics I used today weren't particularly sophisticated, Ghost. They were basic defensive operations executed with attention to terrain features and personnel capabilities. Any competent Marine could have done the same thing. With respect, ma'am, no, they couldn't have. I watched from the perimeter when I arrived with the medical team. You were processing information from 12 different radio channels simultaneously, coordinating fire teams that had never trained together, adapting to changing enemy tactics in real time, and personally engaging targets while maintaining command oversight. That's not basic operations. That's mastery. Doc Jasper added his support from his position near the medical staging area. As Sergeant Major, you saved lives today just like you saved lives in Fallujah. But this time, you didn't just save the 6 people in immediate danger. You saved everyone on this base by organizing a defense that should have been impossible with the personnel and time available. That knowledge needs to be passed on, not lost, because you're too humble to recognize how exceptional you are. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of base security personnel who'd been processing evidence from the firefight. They brought with them recovered enemy equipment, identification documents, and intelligence materials that painted a disturbing picture of what had almost happened at Camp Pendleton. Captain Fiona Carter, back in her intelligence officer role, briefed the assembled leadership on preliminary findings. Sir, the enemy force wasn't random. They were coordinated, well-equipped, and had detailed knowledge of our base layout, security protocols, and personnel deployments. We're looking at what appears to be a planned assault by a sophisticated organization with access to classified information. Hector's expression darkened. Are you telling me we have a security breach? Sir, it's too early to say definitively, but the evidence suggests these hostiles had inside information. They knew which approaches had sensor delays, where our armory was located, and what our standard response protocols would be. Without Sergeant Major Sullivan's intervention, they would have achieved their objectives. Martha, who'd been listening quietly, spoke up with a question that made everyone in the briefing turn to stare at her. Captain Carter, did you recover any communications equipment that might indicate coordination with external organizations? Yes, ma'am. Encrypted radios, satellite phones, and what appears to be a portable intelligence gathering system. We're still analyzing the data. When you analyze that data, look for references to other military installations with similar security profiles. Look for patterns of reconnaissance activity over the past 6 months. And look for any mentions of civilian personnel in non-combat roles. Fiona's eyes widened as the implications hit her. You think they were targeting support staff? Testing whether facilities would notice surveillance of people in positions that don't usually draw attention? I think that if I was planning to infiltrate military bases, I'd start by studying the people nobody pays attention to. Kitchen staff, maintenance workers, cleaning crews. We're invisible until someone needs us, which makes us perfect for gathering intelligence or, if properly placed, for sabotaging security when it matters most. The briefing room fell silent as everyone processed what Martha was suggesting. If hostile organizations had identified that support staff were often overlooked and undervalued, they could be systematically placing assets in those positions across multiple facilities. It would be elegant, effective, and nearly impossible to detect until it was too late. Hector made a decision with the kind of swift certainty that characterized effective command. Carter, expand your investigation to include all base personnel, regardless of position. Cross-reference with other installations that have experienced security incidents in the past year. And Martha, he turned to address her directly, I need you to think about this from an operational planning perspective. If you were setting up a long-term infiltration network using support staff positions, how would you do it? Martha's response came after only a moment's consideration, suggesting she'd already been thinking along these lines. I'd identify veterans with specialized skills who'd accepted civilian positions after retirement, Force Recon, SEALs, Special Forces, people with combat experience and tactical expertise, who'd be perfect for defending a facility if activated, but who blend into support roles during normal operations. I'd place them strategically across multiple installations, create a network that looks like random employment, but is actually a coordinated asset distribution. The briefing room was absolutely silent. What Martha had just described wasn't theoretical infiltration planning. It was a description of a real operational network. And the way she'd described it, with such specific detail about personnel selection and strategic placement, suggested intimate knowledge of exactly how such a system would be structured. Hector studied Martha's face with the intense focus of someone trying to read a classified document. Sergeant Major, are you speaking hypothetically, or are you describing something that actually exists? Before Martha could answer, her personal effects locker in the kitchen, which nobody had ever examined closely, began emitting a sound that made several security personnel reach for their weapons. It was the distinctive tone of an encrypted communication device, the kind used for classified operations that required absolute security. Veterans transitioning to civilian careers benefit from specialized education programs that recognize military experience. Online universities now offer degree programs with credit for military training, professional certification courses in high-demand fields, and career counseling services. Legal services help veterans navigate benefits claims, appeal denials, and access earned entitlements. Educational institutions that understand military backgrounds provide pathways to new careers while honoring years of service and sacrifice. Martha's expression didn't change, but something in her posture shifted, became more alert, more focused. "General Hector, I need to take that call. It's classified above your clearance level." The statement should have been ridiculous. A lieutenant general had one of the highest security clearances in the military, but Hector had spent 30 years in service and recognized the tone of someone accessing black operations that existed outside normal command structures. "Understood. Use Colonel Archer's office. We'll maintain security perimeter." Martha walked to her locker with measured steps, retrieved a phone that looked like standard military issue, but with subtle modifications that marked it as something far more sophisticated. She moved into the private office, closed the door, and accepted the call. "Sullivan." The voice on the other end was electronically modified, impossible to identify, but carried authority that transcended normal military hierarchy. "Sergeant Major, we've been monitoring the situation at Camp Pendleton. Impressive response time, 0 casualties, textbook defensive operations." "Who is this?" "You know who this is, Martha. You've known since you accepted the kitchen position 6 months ago that you weren't really retired. You were redeployed to a monitoring position as part of protocol oversight." Martha's hand tightened on the phone. "I was told the protocol was suspended after Seth died. I was told I could retire for real, that the network would continue without my direct involvement. The protocol was never suspended. It was compartmentalized. You're one of 17 combat veterans placed in civilian support positions across military installations in the continental United States. Your activation today revealed the system's effectiveness. It also revealed that hostile organizations are aware of the concept and attempting to replicate it. So, everything I suspected about the attack today was correct. They weren't just hitting Camp Pendleton. They were testing response capabilities across multiple installations simultaneously. Your facility was the only one that successfully repelled the assault, and that's because you were there. The other locations suffered casualties and security breaches that we're still assessing." Martha closed her eyes, feeling the weight of implications she'd hoped to avoid. "How many casualties?" 17 dead, 43 wounded across 4 bases. Your success at Pendleton means we have at least one data point showing the protocol works, but it also means you're now exposed. The network is compromised. We need to discuss reactivation. I'm 58 years old. I work in a kitchen because that's all I have left to give. I can't. You just organized a perfect defense against overwhelming odds with no preparation and minimal resources. Age hasn't diminished your capabilities, Martha. We need you back. Full reactivation. The 17 veterans in the network are at risk. You're the only one who knows all their identities. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, laying out a situation that Martha had been dreading since the moment she'd heard those encrypted radios among the enemy equipment. The protocol wasn't just a defensive network. It was an intelligence operation designed to identify and neutralize threats to military installations by placing highly qualified veterans in positions where they could observe, assess, and respond without hostile organizations recognizing them as threats. And now that the system had been activated, everyone involved was potentially compromised. When Martha emerged from the office 20 minutes later, her expression was carefully neutral, but Hector recognized the look of someone who just received mission orders they couldn't refuse. "Problem, Sergeant Major?" "Situation requiring attention, sir, but nothing that impacts base operations here." The lie came easily, necessarily, because some operations existed outside normal command structures for very good reasons. The next 3 hours brought a steady stream of visitors to Martha's position. Young Marines who wanted to apologize, to thank her, to simply be in the presence of someone whose story had become legendary in the span of a single afternoon. She handled each interaction with the same patient dignity, accepting apologies without making people grovel, offering wisdom without being preachy, and demonstrating through every action what real leadership looked like. Bradley Fletcher returned after dark, carrying a handwritten letter that he had spent 2 hours composing. Sergeant Major, I know I apologized earlier, but I needed to put it in writing, to make it real, to have something I can look at years from now and remember the day I learned what real service looks like. Martha accepted the letter, read it in silence, then looked up at the young Marine who'd spent months making her life difficult. Fletcher, you did well today under fire. You followed orders, adapted to changing situations, and put other people's safety above your own comfort. That's what matters going forward. Use today as a turning point, not as a burden you carry forever. But how can I not carry it? How do I move past knowing I treated a hero like garbage? By becoming the kind of Marine who would never make that mistake again. By treating every person you encounter with the respect they deserve as human beings, regardless of their position or appearance. By remembering that everyone has a story, and some of those stories involve sacrifices you can't imagine. Martha paused, then added quietly, and by understanding that I never needed you to know about my service record to deserve basic human dignity. The problem wasn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem was that you treated someone badly because you thought their position made them less important. Fix that, and you'll have learned the right lesson. Kelvin Anderson's approach was more hesitant, carrying his tablet, but holding it like a child's security blanket, rather than a tool of superior knowledge. Sergeant Major, I've been thinking about what you said regarding technical knowledge versus tactical experience. I realize that I've been studying warfare like it's a video game, where knowing the specifications of weapons makes you an expert. But watching you today, seeing how you processed information and made decisions under pressure, I understand now that expertise is about applying knowledge in impossible situations. Would you really teach me that, even after how I doubted you? Anderson, bring your tablet to our sessions. That technical knowledge is valuable when combined with practical experience. You've got the foundation. Now we build real understanding on top of it. 0500 hours Monday. Don't be late. Iris Candace and Willow Hazel arrived together, both showing signs of having spent the past hours crying and processing the magnitude of their behavior. Iris carried a photograph of her grandfather in dress uniform, the image worn from years of being kept in her wallet. Sergeant Major Sullivan, you said you knew my grandfather, Gunnery Sergeant Thomas Candace. Could you tell me about him? My memories are all from when I was young, and I want to know what he was like as a Marine, what kind of warrior he was. Martha took the photograph, studied the face captured in faded color, and smiled with genuine warmth. Tom Candace was the kind of Marine who made everyone around him better. In Desert Storm, we were pinned down by enemy fire for 6 hours, and your grandfather kept morale up by telling increasingly ridiculous jokes until people were laughing despite being scared out of their minds. He had this theory that fear couldn't coexist with humor, so he weaponized comedy. She handed the photo back carefully. He died saving his unit in Helmand Province, didn't he? Yes, ma'am. Drew enemy fire so his team could reach safety. That's exactly how he would have wanted to go, protecting his people. He'd be proud of you for joining the Corps, Cyrus, and he'd want you to learn from today rather than being destroyed by guilt. Honor his memory by becoming the kind of leader who values every person in your command. Dylan Ronan was the last to approach, and his shame was written across every line of his body language. He didn't carry a letter or a photograph, just an honest question that showed more growth than any prepared speech could have. Sergeant Major, why didn't you ever fight back? Against the pranks, the mockery, all of it. You could have destroyed us with a word, revealed who you were, and made us look like the idiots we are. Why did you just take it? Martha considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Because fighting back would have required revealing my background, and I chose invisibility for a reason. After my son died, I needed to be close to Marines without being in command. Anonymity gave me that. But also, Ronan, I've survived actual combat. I've been shot at by people who genuinely wanted to kill me. Your pranks were annoying, but they weren't life-threatening. I've learned to save my energy for battles that actually matter. But we made you miserable for 6 months. You made my job harder. That's different from making me miserable. I've been miserable, Dylan. I buried my only child and had to keep functioning. I've held dying Marines and promised to tell their families they were heroes. I've made decisions that cost lives because there were no good options available. Compared to that, sugar in my seasoning is just a minor inconvenience. Martha's voice softened. Use your planning skills for good going forward. That's how you make this right. If Martha's story inspired you, we've got 2 more incredible stories waiting on your screen right now. Don't let this momentum stop. click one and keep watching. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now so you never miss stories like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. The following morning brought formal recognition in the form of a base-wide formation that felt more like a ceremony than standard military assembly. Every Marine at Camp Pendleton who could be spared from essential duties was present, standing in perfect ranks as Lieutenant General Hector prepared to make an announcement that would become part of base lore. Martha stood to one side in fresh civilian clothing, her torn shirt from the previous day having been carefully preserved as evidence for the investigation. She'd been offered a uniform for the occasion, but had declined, preferring to maintain the distinction between her retired status and active duty personnel. Hector's voice carried across the formation with practiced authority. Marines, yesterday you witnessed something that doesn't happen often in military service. You saw expertise rise from unexpected quarters. You saw leadership emerge from someone working in a support role. You saw a retired sergeant major with 28 years of combat experience save every life on this base through tactical excellence and personal courage. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. But more importantly, you witnessed a failure of perception. Multiple personnel on this base treated Sergeant Major Martha Sullivan with disrespect, mockery, and outright cruelty because they couldn't see past her position as kitchen staff. They assumed that someone working in support must be less capable, less experienced, less worthy of respect than those in combat roles. The assembled Marines shifted uncomfortably, many of them recognizing their own contributions to the climate that had allowed Martha to be mistreated. Today, I'm implementing a base-wide policy change. Every Marine, regardless of rank or position, will undergo mandatory respect training that emphasizes valuing all personnel for their contributions, rather than judging them by their job titles. Because the reality is that some of our most valuable assets might be working in roles you don't consider important, and your ability to recognize and leverage that expertise could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Hector turned to face Martha directly. Sergeant Major Sullivan, would you join me at the front of the formation? Martha walked forward with measured steps, conscious of hundreds of eyes tracking her movement. When she reached Hector's position, he produced a presentation case containing a medal that made several senior NCOs actually gasp in recognition. Sergeant Major Martha Elizabeth Sullivan, on behalf of the United States Marine Corps and in recognition of your extraordinary heroism in organizing the defense of Camp Pendleton, I'm presenting you with the Civilian Service Medal, the highest recognition we can offer to non-active duty personnel. Your actions yesterday saved countless lives and demonstrated the kind of tactical excellence that defines the best of Marine Corps leadership. He pinned the medal to her civilian jacket with ceremonial precision, then stepped back and rendered another crisp salute that Martha returned with equal formality. The formation erupted in applause that continued for a full minute, Marines clapping and cheering for someone most of them had never really seen until yesterday. But the ceremony wasn't finished. Sergeant Cassian stepped forward with something wrapped in cloth, his weathered face showing emotion that senior NCOs rarely displayed publicly. Sergeant Major, on behalf of all enlisted personnel at Camp Pendleton, we'd like to present you with something to remember us by. He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a photograph, professionally framed, showing Martha during the firefight. She was behind the M249, directing operations, her face set in concentration, the torn shirt revealing her Force Recon tattoo. Someone had captured the exact moment when leadership and expertise had transformed from invisible to undeniable. We want you to know that your family here now, ma'am, not kitchen staff, not a civilian advisor, family, and we won't forget what you did for us. Martha accepted the frame with hands that trembled slightly, the first real show of emotion she'd displayed since the attack began. Thank you, Gunny. All of you. This means more than you know. The formation was dismissed, but before the Marines dispersed, Corporal Mason Connor stepped forward with a proposal that would reshape base culture in ways nobody had anticipated. Sergeant Major, some of us have been talking. The junior enlisted mostly, we want to establish something we're calling the Sullivan Standard. It's a code we're committing to follow regarding how we treat all base personnel, regardless of their position. Respect, dignity, recognition that everyone contributes to mission success. We'd like your permission to make it official. Martha looked at the young Marine who had been her first defender in the kitchen, who'd shown respect when respect wasn't popular, who represented the best of what the Corps could produce when given the right example. Make it official, Connor, and hold each other accountable to it. That's how culture changes, not through orders from above, but through standards that young Marines enforce among themselves. The next 6 months brought transformation beyond what anyone had anticipated. Martha's combat tactics advisor position evolved into a full-scale mentorship program that drew applicants from across the base. Bradley, Kelvin, Iris, and Dylan became her first official students, attending sessions 3 times weekly at 0500 hours, where she taught everything from defensive operations to ethical leadership. Bradley discovered that his physical strength combined with tactical training made him an exceptional defensive specialist. He stopped trying to intimidate people and started using his presence to protect them instead. His transformation was so complete that he eventually became an advocate for support personnel rights, arguing passionately in leadership classes that logistics and maintenance were combat multipliers deserving equal respect with line units. Kelvin's technical knowledge, properly channeled, made him invaluable for integrating new technology with tactical doctrine. He stopped memorizing specifications to prove he was smart and started applying information to solve real problems. His tablet became a tool for sharing knowledge rather than demonstrating superiority. Iris discovered leadership abilities she hadn't known she possessed, eventually establishing a mentorship program, pairing experienced Marines with new recruits to prevent the kind of cultural failures that had allowed Martha to be mistreated. She kept her grandfather's photograph in her office and told every new Marine about the lesson she'd learned regarding respect and recognition. Dylan channeled his planning skills into developing training scenarios that tested Marines' ability to identify and respond to unconventional threats. His pranks evolved into creative problem-solving that made people better rather than making their lives harder. Lieutenant Forrester, working under Martha's supervision in logistics operations, experienced the most dramatic transformation. Stripped of his authority and forced to see military operations from a support perspective, he developed genuine understanding of how every position contributed to mission success. 6 months later, when he was reassigned to a command position, his leadership style had changed completely. He became known for valuing all personnel equally and leveraging expertise regardless of where it appeared in the organizational structure. But the most significant change happened quietly, in the background, as Martha prepared for the reactivation she'd been dreading. The encrypted phone calls continued weekly, updating her on the status of the other 16 veterans in the protocol network, discussing threat assessments and security implementations that remained classified above most military clearances. 3 months after the attack, Martha was sitting in the mess hall late at night, reviewing training materials for the next day's session, when Doc Jasper found her. He carried 2 cups of coffee and the weary expression of someone who'd been working double shifts in the medical center. "Sergeant Major, can I join you?" "It's after hours, Doc. Call me Martha." He sat across from her, sliding 1 coffee cup in her direction. "I've been thinking about Fallujah, about how you saved my life and the lives of 5 other Marines, about how you carried me 400 meters with shrapnel in your back, about how you never once complained or asked for recognition or expected anything in return. It was my job. It was above and beyond your job, and I've spent 12 years trying to figure out how to repay that debt." Doc paused, gathering courage for what came next. "I know something's going on that you're not talking about. I've seen the encrypted calls. I've noticed how you sometimes stare at nothing like you're solving problems nobody else knows exist. I want you to know that whatever it is, whatever you need, you have people here who would follow you anywhere. Because you saved us once, and we'd like the chance to return the favor." Martha studied Doc's face, seeing genuine concern mixed with warrior loyalty, and made a decision that would change everything about how she approached the next phase of her life. "There are 17 of us," she said quietly. "Combat veterans placed in civilian support positions across military installations. We're a network designed to provide hidden defense capabilities while gathering intelligence on threats that conventional security might miss. The attack on Camp Pendleton was a test of that network, and we passed. But passing means we're now exposed. Hostile organizations know we exist, and they're actively trying to identify and neutralize us." Doc listened without interrupting, his medical training helping him remain calm while processing information that should have been terrifying. "I've been recalled to active duty, not officially but functionally. My job now is to protect the other 16 veterans while we try to identify who's targeting us and why. It's dangerous work, and it's going to take me away from the teaching position I've come to love here. Then let me help. Let us help. You've spent 6 months teaching us tactical operations and ethical leadership. Give us a chance to apply those lessons in support of something that actually matters. Martha wanted to refuse, wanted to keep these young Marines safe from operations that existed in shadows, where accountability disappeared and casualties were classified. But she'd also learned that sometimes the best way to honor people was to trust them with real responsibility. I'll consider it, but Doc, this isn't like the training we do here. This is real-world operations, where mistakes mean people die and success means nobody ever knows you did anything. Sounds like every medical shift I've ever worked. When do we start? The final phase of Martha's time at Camp Pendleton arrived 6 months after the attack, marked by the arrival of a classified courier carrying orders that couldn't be transmitted electronically. She read them in Colonel Archer's office, her expression revealing nothing, while her mind processed implications that would determine the next several years of her life. They're recalling you, aren't they? Archer had been read into enough classified operations to recognize the look of someone receiving deployment orders. Full reactivation, Sergeant Major rank restored, though technically I never officially retired in the standard sense. My terminal leave was actually reassignment to the protocol network. The last 12 years have been active duty conducted in deep cover, and your son was part of it. He knew, he understood. His death was the reason I requested reassignment to monitoring positions, rather than operational leadership. But the network is compromised, and they need someone who knows all 17 veterans to coordinate protection and counterintelligence operations. Archer stood, moved to his window overlooking the base where Marines were conducting their daily training with discipline and purpose that had improved dramatically over 6 months. You changed this place, Martha. You changed these Marines. The Sullivan Standard isn't just a slogan. It's become part of base culture. People treat each other better because you showed them what real leadership looks like. They were always capable of being better. They just needed someone to hold up a mirror and show them what they'd become. When do you leave? 72 hours. Enough time to say goodbye, transfer my training programs to permanent instructors, and prepare my replacement as combat tactics advisor. The goodbye took 3 days, each one filled with emotional farewells and final lessons that Martha tried to compress into limited time. Her students, the original 4 who'd learned respect through humiliation and growth, took the news hardest. "But we're not ready," Bradley protested, his voice carrying an edge of panic. "There's so much more to learn. You can't just leave now. Fletcher, you're more ready than you think." The real lesson was never about tactical operations or defensive positions. It was about recognizing that everyone has value, everyone has a story, and leadership means leveraging all available resources regardless of where they appear in the organizational structure. You've learned that. Now you teach others. Where are you going? What will you be doing? Classified. But know that what you learned here matters beyond this base. The respect you show people, the way you value contributions over appearances, that ripples outward in ways you can't predict. Carry it forward. Iris had matured dramatically, her grandfather's photograph now joined by one of Martha taken during a training session. "Sergeant Major, you gave me back my family's honor. I was treating people exactly opposite of how my grandfather would have wanted. You showed me what real Marine Corps values look like. Thank you." Your grandfather would be proud of who you've become, Iris. Keep that photograph close. Let it remind you of what service means when things get complicated. Kelvin approached with his tablet, but this time displaying something unexpected. He'd programmed a tactical training simulation based entirely on Martha's teaching methodology, designed to help future Marines learn defensive operations through practical problem-solving rather than rote memorization. I wanted to create something that would preserve what you taught us, something that would let your expertise benefit Marines you'll never meet personally. Will you review it? Tell me if I got it right. Martha spent an hour going through Kelvin's program, making minor adjustments, adding nuances that came from decades of experience. By the end, she was genuinely impressed. "This is excellent work, Anderson. Submit it through channels for official evaluation. This could become part of standard tactical training across the Corps." Dylan had transformed most completely, channeling his creative energy into developing anti-harassment protocols and cultural improvement programs. He'd become base champion for support personnel rights, arguing that kitchen staff, maintenance workers, and administrative personnel deserve the same respect as combat troops. "Sergeant Major, I can never undo the harm I caused you, but I can make sure nobody else has to endure what you went through. Every day I try to honor what you taught me by treating people better than I treated you. Is that enough? It's everything, Ronan. Growth, real growth, means becoming someone your past self wouldn't recognize. You've done that. Now help others do the same. The final gathering happened in the mess hall, appropriately enough, where Martha's journey at Camp Pendleton had begun with mockery and ended with respect. Every Marine who had been present during the attack attended, along with dozens more who had learned from Martha's teaching over 6 months. Sergeant Cassian organized the event with military precision, but the tone was more wake than ceremony. People gathering to mourn the loss of a teacher who'd changed their lives while celebrating what she'd taught them. Martha stood before the assembled Marines, conscious that this might be the last time she addressed them collectively, and chose her words with care. 6 months ago, I came to Camp Pendleton to work in the kitchen because I needed to be close to Marines without being in command. I'd lost my son to this service, and I was trying to find a way to stay connected without feeling responsible for sending anyone else into danger. She paused, letting that truth settle. What I found instead was a reminder that service takes many forms. Combat leadership is important, but so is cooking food that keeps warriors healthy. Tactical training matters, but so does maintaining equipment that saves lives. Every position contributes to mission success, and the moment we start valuing some roles over others, we weaken the entire organization. You taught me that lesson as much as I taught you. You showed me that young Marines are capable of extraordinary growth when given the right examples and the courage to confront their own mistakes. You proved that culture can change, that respect can be learned, and that honor isn't about rank or position, but about how you treat people when nobody's watching. Martha looked across the sea of faces, seeing reflections of her son in every young Marine, seeing potential that would be realized or squandered based on lessons learned and applied. I'm leaving tomorrow for duty I can't discuss, but I want you to know that these 6 months meant everything to me. You gave me purpose when I thought I had none left. You gave me hope that the Corps will continue producing warriors who understand that strength without honor is just violence. Carry forward the Sullivan Standard. Treat people with respect. Value all contributions. Recognize that everyone has a story, and some of those stories involve sacrifices you can't imagine. Do that, and you'll honor not just me, but every person who's ever worn this uniform and understood what it means to serve something greater than yourself. The applause was thunderous, sustained, and accompanied by tears from Marines who had learned that saying goodbye to a genuine leader was one of the hardest parts of military service. Martha's departure the next morning was deliberately low-key, just a civilian car picking her up from base housing before dawn. But she wasn't alone. Doc Jasper, Bradley Fletcher, Kelvin Anderson, Iris Candace, Dylan Ronan, and a dozen other Marines had gathered to see her off, standing in the pre-dawn darkness like an honor guard for someone whose service continued beyond public recognition. "Where will you go?" Bradley asked, his voice quiet. "Wherever I'm needed, doing what needs to be done. Will we see you again? If I've done my job right, you won't need to. You'll carry forward what you learned and teach it to the next generation. That's how legacy works in the military. Not through individual heroes, but through lessons passed person to person until they become institutional knowledge." The car pulled away as the sun began rising over Camp Pendleton, its light catching the windows of the mess hall, where Martha Sullivan had served food, endured mockery, and ultimately revealed herself as someone whose service transcended conventional recognition. In the weeks that followed, stories about the crazy old vet who had saved Camp Pendleton began circulating through military networks, growing with each retelling until they achieved legendary status. But for those who'd actually known Martha, who'd learned from her and grown because of her, the real story was quieter and more profound. It was about a mother who'd lost her only child, but found purpose serving the next generation. About a warrior who'd chosen invisibility over recognition because the work mattered more than the credit. About a teacher who demonstrated that the most important battles are sometimes fought in kitchens and classrooms rather than on traditional battlefields. And late at night, when Martha was far from Camp Pendleton conducting operations that would never appear in official records, she would sometimes think about those young Marines and smile, knowing that the best way to honor her son's memory wasn't through public monuments or formal recognition, but through the quiet transformation of individuals who learned to see people as they actually were, rather than as appearances suggested. The Sullivan Standard lived on, growing and spreading, carried by Marines who had learned a simple truth from a woman working in a kitchen. Real warriors don't need to advertise their strength. Real service doesn't require recognition. And real honor is measured not by medals displayed, but by lives changed through patient teaching and personal example. And somewhere in classified files, accessible only to those with clearances exceeding lieutenant general rank, a notation existed in Martha Sullivan's permanent record. Ghost Unit 7, Phantom Protocol, Active Duty, they never see us coming.